Welcome to this workshop presentation. It will start with a short introduction to the National Archives. I'll then give a brief introduction to our records. And in keeping with the aims, we will briefly explore some different interpretations of this history from 4 historians. We'll then turn to 4 case studies based on archival documents, and they've been chosen to give you the long view of this story. Under colonial rule, India's population provided the British Empire with a ready source of cheap and mobile labourers. Many Indians became indentured labourers to escape widespread poverty and famine in the 19th century. Some travelled alone, others brought their families to settle in the colonies they worked in. The demand for Indian indentured labourers increased dramatically after the abolition of slavery. They were sent sometimes in larger numbers, to plantation colonies producing high-value crops such as sugar in Africa and the Caribbean. Indians traveled to many places to work as indentured labour, and depending on the destinations, indentures started at different times. At the heart of this story are real people's lived experiences. There are many difficult and upsetting episodes, and in introducing this topic, I am conscious of this. In doing this presentation, I recognize there is still much debate and still a lot more research to be done. I also recognize that there may be terms used in historical records that reflect attitudes and language at the time that may now be considered derogatory or offensive. So the National Archives is based in Kew, Richmond. It's the home of the British government's archive. We have documents spanning over 1,000 years of history, and they capture some of the key moments in Britain's story. Access to the archives is free, and there's also good online access to images and some document collections. As part of the National Archives, we provide education sessions to children and young people. We also offer an outreach service, and I'm part of that outreach service that aims to engage with adults and community organizations. Outreach have been developing projects with communities for a number of years, with a particular focus on Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. These have traditionally been underrepresented in user figures. Workshops like today's aim to engage new audiences and audiences that may assume that National Archives has nothing to offer them. In the past, we have run projects such as Caribbean Through a Lens that used images of the Caribbean to engage groups around the country to explore their African Caribbean heritage. More recently, as part of the commemoration for the First World War, we engaged South Asian communities to explore their involvement in the war. To mark the 100th anniversary of the 1919 race riots in Britain last year, outreach led projects in Liverpool and Cardiff to mark this important moment. All our projects are highlighted on our website, and please note the link on the slide. And this new project on Indian indenture is part of our outreach offer that aims to get people interested in our rich collection of records relating to this important topic. So at the National Archives, we have a good selection of research guides that help users get introduced to searching our documents. And we are fortunate that an introductory guide has been specially created for our records on Indian indentured labour. So this guide is available, and I've got the link up there, so we can obviously send that through as well. And I might just be quick with these slides because I realized that we're a little bit behind, but just to say that the guide is accessible. It takes the reader through some simple steps to undertake their research. The first step, which we advise for other topics too, is to do a simple word search using our online catalogue search facility, Discovery. A simple word search such as coolie and Indian will immediately provide results, which you can then start to filter by date and in other ways. The National Archives has also collaborated with Find My Past, a company specializing in family history research, to digitize records relating to sea voyages that include details of indentured laborers. And finally, the guide highlights for the slightly more advanced researcher ways you can start to access information about various islands where indentured laborers were taken to get more specific information. You can use our large correspondence registers, and they are able to locate individual pieces of correspondence that may relate to your particular study or research. So what I'm proposing is the next 2 slides, we'll just miss those because the guide will take you through. So if we can move to the 4 historians slide. So just to recap, the guide that is in that slide link is available for you to look through. And obviously, if you need some assistance, then through the team at Girmit, we can help. So let's look at four historians. What follows is a short introduction to four historians, highlighting the different and evolving ways in which debates about indenture and the writing of this history have taken shape. It highlights how historians choose to focus or use certain documents or approaches in helping to construct their interpretations. So we start with Hugh Tinker. Hugh Tinker's path-breaking book, A New System of Slavery, published in 1974, adopted an anti-colonial approach that broke with the past. Tinker's argument was that the slave system laid the foundations for the indenture system. His research highlighted deaths on ships, the loss of family life, and the unfairness of the recruitment process. In focusing on plantation life, Tinker touched on topics such as the deep changes that occurred in terms of identity, language, and cultural expression. His research argued that the system of indenture was a continuation of an oppressive system that included the use of bonded labor and a punitive and harsh regime of discipline. Tinker argued that indenture was a new form of slavery in all but name, with one distinction. Indenture was temporary servitude as opposed to permanent. And this is his quote: "There was one factor and only one in which the coolies had the advantage over the enslaved, their predecessors. At last, one day, their bondage must come to an end. Before that day arrived, some were dead and others were crippled by disease, while some were so in debt or otherwise ensnared by the system that they could not extricate themselves. But for some, for most, a day would come when the indenture was cancelled and the master no longer had a hold over him. Certainly, it was this expectation, rather than any dream of escape or revolt, which gave the coolie hope." So that's Hugh Tinker. Moving now to Bridge Lal. Bridge Lal, who is the grandson of a Fijian indentured labourer, brought a new focus to the study of indentured emigrants with his quantitative analysis of over 45,000 migrants who went from India to Fiji, providing much needed details as to their social, economic, and geographical background. His research revealed that a lot less of those who emigrated to Fiji were from the lower castes, and that there were push factors that led Indians to board ships and come to Fiji. So he, in his book or his article, quotes, "The diverse social and cultural composition of the indentured workforce. In the case of Fiji, the migrants came from over 300 different castes and districts, spoke a variety of dialects, if not languages, and varied in their motivations for migrating." He also brought a wider attention to a well-organized system. Lal cited evidence from the Indian province of UP, which showed that the poorest areas contributed the largest number of emigrants to Fiji. Many of those recruited from this area were already working outside of their towns and villages in other employment, in jute, tea, and textiles, before they undertook the long journey to Fiji. In pointing this out, Lal wanted to make the point that rather than being deceived into leaving their homes, many had already chosen to leave of their own volition. Lal was also able to conduct research in India using his ancestral links to compare life there with the new lives of the indentured immigrants. He was able to argue that the new surroundings away from India were more equal and less oppressive, and that indentured laborers established new relationships with each other as Jahaji Bhai or shipmates, and there is also the Jahaji band or a sister, ship sister. The third historian I'm moving on to is Marina Carter. So Marina Carter's research is particularly on Mauritius and has helped focus on the attention on how indentured settlers remade their lives. She's done a lot of work with letters that she's been able to look at, and her research has further honed in on the detail of the laborers' lives by looking at their personal stories. Her research uncovered how the system caused social dislocation and the breakdown of family relationships. Her research also contributed to studies of how labor was mobilized to go into indenture. She noted that in terms of recruitment, historians have positioned themselves on a scale from coercion to voluntarism. Her own research on Mauritius indicated that there was circular migration and that returnees helped to recruit others in turn. In terms of the working lives of Indian indentured labor, she said historians had come close to seeing every response of workers, from saving money to gambling as an act of resistance, and she advised caution. One of the hardest tasks of the historian is to appraise the experience of workers subjected to exploitative working practices without using a value system wholly inappropriate to customs and expectations, then current. Finally, Gayatri Bahadur's research, which has led to her seminal work, Coolie Woman, used her great-grandmother's story and placed this within a wider colonial context. The disruption in India from what she refers to as imperial capitalism destroyed traditional livelihoods, but has also created new opportunities for men and in particular women to migrate both internally and externally. And this from her book is a quote: "From the beginning, in all the colonies that turned to indenture to rescue their plantations from ruin after slaves were freed, men enormously outnumbered women. This gave women sexual leverage. They could take new partners, and frequently they did. Theirs was often a tale of leaving their country, then leaving their men. Even before leaving their country, many had left their men. I don't know whether my great-grandmother had intentionally left hers. If she was recruited with a husband, she lost him somewhere along the way." Close quote. Tracing the stories such as those of her great-grandmother, she has shown that women were able to use these opportunities to their advantage and not always to be victims. For example, she notes that dowries gave way to a bride price. The old system practiced in India, where the bride's family had to find the money to pay a dowry for marrying their daughter into her new family, was replaced in the colony by a system where prospective grooms had to find the money to win a woman's hand in marriage. So if we now move to the first of the archival documents. So this archival document is in our collection. This is a letter from Gladstone, a plantation owner. It's John Gladstone, father of William Gladstone, the future Prime Minister of Britain. And Gladstone's a plantation owner in British Guiana and representative of the West Indian Association. And he requests a meeting with the Colonial Secretary, Lord Glennig, and Sir George Grey, his Undersecretary, to discuss amending the period of indenture in Guyana from 3 years to 5 years in order that he can have a supply of hill coolies from Bengal work on his plantation. Gladstone warns that after apprenticeship in the West Indies ends, and this is where it says, unless, and it's highlighted in the slide, unless a system of regular continuous labor is adopted, the cultivation of the sugarcane cannot then be carried on with a productive result. His letter warns that after the end of apprenticeship, the female laborers who now work in the field will not continue to do so, and that men are very likely to form combinations for restricting the ordinary and necessary periods of labor, as well as to compel the planters to pay them wages at rates much above their means to comply. So you're seeing that highlighted in the green. But the main point he's making is that he's forecasting that free black labor will kill the sugar trade. So this thing of looking for the alternative is key to understanding this letter. Gladstone warns also in this letter that the abilities of the planters are greatly circumscribed by the competition they have to now struggle with in the sugars of our East India possessions and the costs of labor much below that of Guyana. In short, he is he's asking for minimum indentures of 5 years so that he can compete with planters in Mauritius and elsewhere. So this thing of competition and that being key for looking for labor that can allow the plantation economy to continue. Now, this is also in our collection, and this is an image of an indenture contract, illustrating in some ways the bureaucratic nature of the recruitment. This contract was agreed to by an Indian laborer. The laborer was agreeing to work for a plantation owner for a period of 5 years as free laborer. So that's also highlighted in the slide. And with mutual consent, again, it's highlighted, in return for accommodation, food, and medical attention. Theoretically, the laborer could secure free passage back to India after 5 years. The contract was in both English and a native language of the laborer. It was also witnessed by the Chief of Police in Calcutta. Later in 1838, Gladstone came under attack from members of the Anti-Slavery Society in London and the press there for introducing a new form of slavery. He does, though, gain the 5-year indentures off from the Colonial Office in exchange for guarantees that return passage to India would be provided to workers who wanted to return. His ship, the Hesperus, left Liverpool in June 1837, traveling to Calcutta, Mauritius, and then Demerara in Guyana. So that's the story. I just want to thank my colleague, Michael Mahoney, for these 2 slides. He did the research looking at Gladstone and this contract. And so I just want to acknowledge his research for this. Thank you. This is just a short slide, or a short introduction before we progress on to a slide that I'm going to show you a little bit later on the 1884 Hossay riots. And so it's worth spending a little time acquainting ourselves with an account of how Indians came to Trinidad, where these Hossay riots happened. So the first ship to arrive in Trinidad was the Fatal Rozak, which arrived on 30th May 1845. In the years that followed, many other ships came and brought thousands of Indians to Trinidad. The two main ports from which Indians boarded ships for Trinidad were Calcutta and Madras. The ships made their way past Sri Lanka, down the Indian Ocean, round the Cape of Good Hope, and then across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. These were very long and hazardous journeys. And the historian Ron Ramdin, in his book, The Other Middle Passage, published a journal kept by Captain Adolphus Swinton that provides an insight into the journey across the seas from India to Trinidad. It is a document that allows us a rare glimpse into the journey itself. It is only one ship at one particular time, and the story narrated is within this context. The ship left Calcutta on 17th March 1858 with 324 Indians. What is immediately noticeable in reading the journal is the heavy incidences of sickness on board and the poor provision of food. Somewhat unusually on this voyage, the captain's wife, Jane Swinton, was also present, and the journal records her giving assistance to the sick. In total, 124 Indians died on board as they made their way from India to Trinidad. Extracts from the journal were published in 1859. The editor at the time highlighted the levels of death, as well as the financial loss to the ship's owners. And despite this extraordinary rupture and challenge of making a life anew in a strange land, Indians did maintain traditions and become part of Caribbean life. And the Jose celebrations is one expression of this. So this is a report by Henry Norman. It's a report that we have at the National Archives. Henry Norman at the time was the governor of Jamaica. Norman is a former officer in the Indian Army who is able to speak Hindi. And he was invited to Trinidad to conduct an inquiry into the Jose riots in 1884 in San Fernando. It is a formal report and goes into some detail about the event in which a procession of Indians was fired upon by troops. The report takes an unsympathetic view of the crowd, arguing that the celebrants had been warned not to enter the town. Norman's report endorses the actions of the Trinidad authorities, not only in regulating the Jose celebration, but also in opening fire on 30th October. The Jose procession has its background in the Shia Muslim procession of Muharram, which commemorates the killing of Hussein, a revered figure in Shia Islam. Like other festivals from India that arrived in the Caribbean, it came to express a sense of a shared culture and interaction. Both Muslims and Hindus took part. In his report, Norman argues that the processions no longer remained religious in character. So he quotes, "In fact, the ceremony, although it is purely appertaining to the Mohammedans, is one in which most of the persons engaged are Hindus, and the whole celebration has in Trinidad long ceased to have a religious significance and has come to be regarded as a sort of national Indian demonstration of a rather turbulent character, and common to both Hindus and Mohammedans." The report raises concerns that the celebration has become boisterous in character and that celebrants are armed with cutlasses and other agricultural equipment, and that it has become a way for Indians to air their grievances. Referring to his military experience from India, Norman says that this type of procession in India would be a lot more peaceful. Somewhat in disappointment, Norman ends his report by saying that since arriving in India, Indians have started complaining more. At the same time, he acknowledges that some of the overseers and managers did mistreat Indians, but that this was not too widespread. Norman highlights that some of those exploiting the Indians were fellow countrymen. He asserts that Indians were usually well treated and that many elected to either stay in Trinidad or return back after going to India. The Jose riot and the killing of the Indians was a controversial issue at the time and has become a key historical incident in the history of Indian indenture, with various historians and writers having commented upon it. The Jose event has been seen as an expression of cross-community alliances and lived experiences beyond the life of the plantation. It was this expression of independence that historians argue was most upsetting to the authorities. And the use of an official like Norman may have been an attempt to dampen dissent by using his authority as an old India hand to water down claims that the Indians had been treated unfairly. So this is, again, another record in the National Archives. And this is part of a register of correspondence at the National Archives. And we have this letter from the Government House in Fiji to Alfred Littleton, MP, Secretary of State for the Colonies, responding to a request for information on coolie suicides. The letter says, that the general conditions of life of the indentured Indian coolie appears to be unattractive and monotonous, while the disproportion of women to men imported from India for work on plantations in Fiji, some 30 to 33% only, renders quarrels among the sexes frequent and violent, and the Indian coolie is particularly prone to suicide for what appears to be the most inadequate of reasons. The enclosure accompanying the letter, as shown in this slide, is headed Deaths by Suicide. Indentured here includes 6 cases of deaths by suicide. The first case is the case of Dhaniram, who was indentured to the Labasa plantation in 1901 and committed suicide by hanging. The entry reads, Dhaniram, indentured in 1901 to Labasa plantation, committed suicide by hanging. It appeared that his wife and he quarreled, and it is supposed that he, by shaking her violently, a mode of causing death said to be peculiar to central India, brought on cerebral compression, which caused her death in a few hours. On being taxed with this, Dhaniram went into the bush and committed suicide. Further cases in the report include a case of a man who kills himself after threats received for siding with an overseer, the case of a man who went blind and in despair killed single man who died alone, who's discovered problems, or the man who took his own. The topic can illustrate how the 4 historians we highlighted earlier have each interpreted the evidence in different ways. Hugh Tinker said that it was disputes over women that were the main cause of suicides among men, while sexual jealousy, for example, cannot be discounted. Focusing largely or solely on this cause has been questioned. Bridgelal has argued that it was the disturbance of the wider structures of family, community, and culture that were to blame. He highlighted that place of origin could also have a bearing on who was affected. He also made the point that it was early arrivals that were particularly prone to suicide with the shock of the new work routine. Gayatri Bahadur said that it was interesting to note that lower caste laborers were less likely to commit suicide than those of a higher caste. And similarly, the figures for women committing suicide were very few, suggesting that unlike men, they did not feel the sense of loss of status and authority. And finally, Marina Carter pointed to attempts by colonial officials to increasingly understand this phenomenon of suicide by trying to compare figures in the colonies with those in India. Carter urged caution in viewing wife murders too emotively as an example of the dark side of plantation life, and said more analysis comparing data of wife murder in India and the colonies was needed. So this is a record that we don't have, but is accessible via other ways. It's the minutes of a legislative meeting. So this is the meeting of the Indian Legislative Council in 1912, shortly before the abolition of indenture in 1917. And the Indian nationalist leader, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, proposed a resolution for the abolition of indenture. He highlighted the abuses under the system, including how laborers were punished, the suicide rate, murders on the plantations, and deaths on board ship. Having highlighted the iniquities of the system, Gokhale then brings part of his argument to a close by saying, "These, sir, are the principal features of the system. And when it is remembered that the victims of the system, and I can call them by no other name, are generally simple, ignorant, illiterate, resourceless people belonging to the poorest classes of this country, and that they are induced to enter, or it be more correct to say, are entrapped into entering into these arguments by the unscrupulous representations of wily recruiters, no fair-minded man will, I think, hesitate to say that the system is a monstrous system, iniquitous in itself, based on fraud and maintained by force. He will demur to the statement that the system so wholly opposed to modern sentiments of justice and humanity is a grave blot on the civilization of any country that tolerates it." Gokhale's argument was that the indenture system degraded Indian people and that this was a matter of real concern for Indian nationalists. His views were challenged by others on the council, arguing that Indians had also benefited greatly from leaving India. When it came to voting, Gokhale's resolution was defeated. The trouble over the status of free Indians in South Africa had been brewing for some time, and nationalist leaders like Gandhi were already involved. Originally, it was this issue that exercised nationalists like Gokhale and got him involved in the campaign that then started to address the whole Indian indentured labor question and its eventual abolition. It was in the war years that Gandhi further stepped up the campaign alongside other nationalist voices, which grew into an anti-indenture movement, leading to a further resolution of the Indian Legislative Council in 1916 that finally paved the way for the end of indenture. No longer as reliant on imported Indian labor, coupled with falling sugar prices and new locations for sugar production in Europe and North America, the end of indenture came at a time when the whole plantation system was also changing. So today's presentation, I hope, has provided you with an introduction to the topic of Indian indenture. We have looked at some competing views on indenture and illustrated this with reference to archival documents. The 4 case studies on the plantation economy, Hosse riots, suicide, and Indian nationalist responses offer an insight into some of the evidence historians use to piece together these histories. And as I mentioned at the opening, the National Archives is free to access, has an impressive selection of records and images that can help you research histories that you may be interested in. And finally, thank you for listening to this presentation.